Hello, Buzzkillers. It's Wild West Day here at the Buzzkill Institute. I'm all dressed up like John Wayne, historically accurate in every detail. And we have one of your favorite historians on the line, here to bust myths and take names. So here we are with Professor Edward O'Donnell. Hello, Professor. How are you?
Very good, Professor. How are you?
Fine. Thanks for coming back on the show. You were on a little while ago talking about all things Irish, and now we have a lot of other American things to talk about today.
Indeed. There's no shortage of stuff to talk about in American history.
And especially about things that are so seared into our consciousness, like the Wild West.
Exactly. I mean, it's one of those things that's just, once you start to think about it and be aware of it, you see it everywhere, whether it's in advertising or in music, imagery, politics. It's just really one of the most fundamental things in the fabric of American identity.
Well, it seems to me that the 1850 to 1900 period is kind of what we think of as the Old West or the Wild West. And it's one of the most misunderstood periods in American history, and the Wild West is part of that. But I think what's so interesting about the way you've talked about it is the geography is one of the first sort of myths, the first sort of problems.
Yeah. I mean, it's more of a conceptual thing, the way that people imagine the West. And this has a lot to do with Hollywood and with, the way we sort of think about it and the reasons we think about it. But most people think of the West as this separate place. So when you think of, say, 1850 or 1860, you think that, people headed west, and at a certain point they crossed a river and they were suddenly, almost like Dorothy coming out after the tornado, suddenly in this totally different place. We're not in Kansas anymore, and that it's really almost a magical place. It's a place of incredible natural beauty, but also danger, and that it's utterly and completely cut off from the real world or from the modern world. And, that's a fine way to think about it, but it's not really accurate. Most people, there was a sort of when you think about moving westward, it wasn't a boundary line.
That's right.
And the West was settled not as a kind of a slowly unrolling carpet of civilization. It was settled in pockets, and it was, California was settled and became a state in 1850, way before much of the West, between, say, Missouri and California became states and had
the sort of
large
interior.
settlements.
The interior got filled. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and also along railroad lines. So wherever the railroads went, that's also where settlement followed. So it was very uneven. And the most important thing is that every one of those places was intimately tied to the east, tied to the industrial cities, tied to the markets and so forth. It wasn't this separate place where people just sort of tried to find their way.
And we should remind Buzzkillers that in this episode we're not going to talk so much about Native Americans in the West or indigenous peoples in the West, but mostly because that deserves a show or a full podcast on its own.
Indeed.
It's really, really about this sort of migration east to west. And what's always fascinated me coming from the East and the Midwest is that what counts as the West, frankly, moves west as the century goes on. I remember when I was a kid going to my grandparents' house in Chicago and caddying in the summertime, the golf association that ran that part of the country was called the Western Golf Association because it was established in 1870, and it was the West.
Yeah, exactly. And also the other word that would be similar to that is the word wilderness. So when when the early settlers came to Virginia and to Massachusetts, the wilderness was like 5 miles away, 5 miles to the west,
barely
and that,
inland. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that line of settlement versus wilderness, or the West, has been steadily moving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But there's also, along with that, and I think because of the wilderness aspect, because of the it's a separate place, there's this very strong myth, the story about the West as a place of, rugged individualism.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one that's really, again, part of the popular culture. So when we think about particularly movies involving John Wayne, we tend to, or even Little House on the Prairie, which is another way in which people were sort of made to understand, pioneers and westward settlement, was that it was just these individuals going out and putting a stake in the ground and start plowing and felling trees and doing all that. And it's not to say that there were not a great many rugged individualists who did incredible things in terms of making a go at it in the West, but it's one of the most powerful myths because the government, is everywhere. And even though it's not quite as evident as it is in, say, Chicago or in New York, but why are people heading west? Well, they're heading west because the government has created a program called the Homestead Act.
Yeah, what is that? I always hear. I think I know a little bit about that, but I certainly don't know enough because it's a big thing that's sort of forgotten in U.S. history.
Right. Well, it's passed right at the very beginning of the Civil War in 1862, and it basically sets up a system of parceling out Western territories, and in small, finite blocks of 160 acres, and you could get them for free, or you could buy them outright at a very, very low cost. You could get them for free if you worked the land and sort of improved it, to use the term of the day, for about 5 years, and proved that you were settling on it. So that was a way of sort of cutting back on the opportunities for speculators. And so this was like, one of the greatest land giveaways of all time. People all over Europe heard about it. So it caused one of the great human migrations in history. So you have rugged individualists, but they're taking advantage of a giant government giveaway from the 1860s on through the early 20th century.
Yes,
and that's just one of the forms of government assistance and government presence in the West.
What are some of the other ways that either the government or other things made the West less sort of rugged and less individual, or at least the settlement of the West?
Right. Well, at the very same time that the Homestead Act was passed, they also passed the act that created the Transcontinental Railroad. And it's quite simple. It's just like with the internet and so many other things. No private company has the capital or the ability to build these stupendous infrastructure projects, so the government steps in and made it possible. And so the Transcontinental Railroad stretches, really binds the nation together, and then it also inspires many, many more railroads to go parallel to it, other transcontinental railroads, Northern Route and so forth, but then all these trunk lines off of it. And it's really, if you think about it like a circulatory system, it's really like the capillaries of the American settlement and capitalism, so spreading out into the West. So if you're a farmer in, say, Montana or in Colorado, and you raise a great crop of some sort of crop of wheat, per se, or you have a great successful herd of cattle, that is great. But if you don't live near a railroad, no one's going to consume your product or buy your product. So the railroad is essential to Western development, and the railroad only happens because of either the federal government or state governments intervening. And so much of this Western settlement comes by virtue of the railroad, and the railroad is really largely a creature of the federal government or state governments. So the government plays an indispensable role in westward settlement.
Is that true with the telegraph as well? Because I know the telegraph couldn't be strung without the railroads.
Right. In fact, the telegraph becomes that sort of other, key thing that brings the West into the East, or connects the West and East through communications. And the telegraph, basically, the original telegraph, just went right alongside the railroads. So they go literally hand in hand, side by side. And again, they start out like the railroads, a whole lot of small operators, and then eventually by the 1880s, just a handful of large monopolistic corporations have taken it over. But at the same time, it's also created this national communication system.
So there are two networks. There's a railroad network and a telegraph network, more or less stretching the whole country.
Right. I mean, two elements of what you might say is, the one element of the transportation revolution and also an element of the communications revolution.
Well, who are these people that are going west? I mean, I think we think of, as you say, only John Wayne and only Vera Miles and people like that who we see in the movies as people going west. Was it all sort of white people from the East?
Yeah, that's another aspect of Western, our imagination about the West, that it comes from popular culture. And so if you look at old, movies from the 40s and 50s and 60s, especially John Wayne movies, there's very few people of color. There might be, a few Chinese figures, then they're just largely operating a laundry. There might be a handful of very minor or even just background characters who are African American. But if we look at the actual data, the West was settled, by enormous numbers of immigrants, of emancipated former slaves after the Civil War, immigrants coming directly to the West, not simply bypassing eastern cities. And you can see this. I mean, the stat I always use with my students is that in 1880, 1/3 of Boston is foreign-born, and 1/3 of Minnesota is foreign-born. It's just a bigger version of it, but
wow.
it's the same statistic. Yeah. So, and there are all kinds of other, I think another good example, another figure in Western lore is, General Custer, and he and his men are in the 7th Cavalry are wiped out in 1876. 40% of the 7th Cavalry were foreign-born. Irish, English,
40%.
German.
Wow.
So even down to the military. And cowboys. Cowboys also were not, these, generic white guys from the East. Cowboys were, Spanish. They were African American. About 1/3 of cowboys were African American. And all the lingo associated with cowboys is generally drawn from Spanish words because it's really Spanish heritage and Spanish culture that invented the cowboy. So
absolutely,
there's a lot more. It's a lot more complicated than one might imagine.
And I think with this myth of just white Americans going west comes this myth, as you say, of the settlement of the West unfolding like a carpet of civilization.
Right. I mean, people tend to think of it as this slow, march of civilization, and people use that phrase from east to west. But if we look at sort of the triggering events, 1849 is the year of the gold rush. So people some people went overland, but some people jumped in boats and, went all the way, down around South America and up again to get to California. And California's population of people of European ancestry, goes from just a few hundred to tens of thousands. And by 1850, it's got enough population to be admitted to the Union as a state. So, and that's just one example of it not really working out. And also, people followed railroads. They followed other gold strikes. So settlement went in there's a logic to it, but it certainly didn't go in this kind of clean, slow, you can almost imagine like a time-lapse image of the U.S. map, and it, coloring civilization sort of, oozes to the west or it unrolls to the west. And that's simply, not the way that it occurred.
Also, the idea that's so common is that these white Easterners built this or laid this carpet of civilization and built the West with their bare hands.
Yeah, and that's another thing that, this idea that they're doing it with, handmade tools and things, which probably did happen. But if you look at the ways in which people, headed west, they brought as much of their stuff as they could. So, one of the things that people on, say, the Oregon Trail describe is, not only, meeting other people and all heading, to the west to make a go of it, but that it's littered, the whole trail is littered with junk. People all, canned food had been invented recently. So there's lots of, cans, and there's, pianos, because at a certain point people say, we're not taking that piano because we can't do it. And lots of other kind of fine furniture and things that, people brought as much of the East and as much of what they would consider to be civilization as possible. And then they continued to import it as much as possible. So you might have a pretty simple, wood cabin, but you aspire at a certain point to put glass windows into it. And then at a certain point to have china, and a certain point to have maybe get a piano, to bring those things that reminded you of the world in which you grew up.
And if the railroads are already stretching the full length of the continent, the full width of the continent by, the 1860s, 1870s, then it's not all that difficult. I mean, it's not impossible to get a piano from New York.
Not at all, because people are discovering, and this is where Sears and Roebuck and other people discover that they can print, what starts out as a very simple sheet of basic items that they can sell, wristwatches and mops and so forth. And then the next thing you know, Sears and Roebuck and this idea of mail order catalogs become an enormous part of the way in which business in America operates, and because they realize there's this growing untapped market of rural America, and it might take a little while to get the things to them, but people can order these things. And so and it's if you read stories or read biographies of people growing up on the farm. The arrival of the Sears catalog was like this magical thing. We would look at it today,
sure.
kind of like a phone book, but in those days it was just page after page of consumer goods, that many of which you could never afford and would never want, but they were fascinating to look at a phonograph that might cost $25, a small fortune in those days. So this again, the market, capitalism, industry, material goods, all of that stuff was present in the West. It wasn't just simply people making clothing out of, bear skins and churning their own butter and so forth. That stuff happened, but people ditched that as soon as they could.
Well, perhaps one of the biggest myths, and one of the one that certainly most movies are made out of, is that there was an inevitable conflict between Native Americans who were in the West or who had been pushed west by earlier things like the Cherokee removal, and the white settlers. Did that always happen? Is it anything like the Hollywood version?
It really not. I mean, certainly it's a very complicated story. You have 500, depending on how you define them, 500 tribal groups, and each with their own distinct culture and nature, and some are sedentary, some are more migratory, and so forth. Most people are familiar with that. But what's really consistent, and this is true of Lewis and Clark and every other group of white Americans who headed west, was that when they met Native Americans, for the most part, they immediately struck up mutually beneficial relationships. White Americans had things that Indians wanted, so they wanted iron kettles, they wanted blankets, there were things that they wanted, and they conversely had things that white settlers and white explorers wanted. They had knowledge of the land, they knew how to hunt certain animals, they knew certain things about the plants and things that were readily available. And so generally speaking, the initial contact phase, not completely free of conflict, but the initial contact phase often was quite cordial and quite mutually beneficial. And it's only as the numbers of white settlers begins to rise, and this is consistent almost everywhere, that at a certain tipping point, then the land grab begins, and pressure is applied to Native Americans to comply with white ways, and from there the relationship begins to disintegrate, and then eventually it becomes violent. So the idea that conflict between these two civilizations was inevitable is really not true. If you look at the historical record, there's plenty of positive, mutually beneficial interaction, and it's only at a certain point that it takes a dramatic turn.
In that way, does it kind of mirror what happens to the first, people who are first Europeans anyway, who arrive on the Atlantic shores and meet Native Americans for the first time? Okay.
Exactly. I mean, when the first, contacts arrive, there's a lot of, there are incidents where there's, violent clashes,
Sure.
but for the most part, there's an attempt to create kind of a mutually beneficial coexistence. And oftentimes, for example, Native Americans have rival tribes and rival groups that they are competing with, and they realize that the newly arrived white settlers could be an asset to them, so they're sometimes brought into those relationships. But the idea that they, fighting from the beginning is just simply one of those myths, and it's a myth that becomes convenient. So at the time, if you look at newspapers, the newspapers describe Indians as simply just reflexively violent and savage, and describe, the headlines like "Another Indian Massacre," meaning Indians massacring white settlers. And there's no backstory, there's no context there to explain what actually happened. Also, sometimes those stories themselves are completely false. Right? There's no. It's a rumor that then makes its way into the Eastern newspapers. So there's a lot of myth-making in the moment as well.
Well, Professor, we're about 20 minutes into the show, and we need to take a sponsorship break. But when we come back, Buzzkillers, I'd like Professor O'Donnell to talk about what is perhaps the biggest element in this story, which is remembering the American West, and how that remembering and that myth-making brought about what we think of as the Wild West. So back in a minute. Well, we're having way too much fun here at the Buzzkill Institute to have a sponsorship ad. That's because, for some reason, Buzzkillers around the world have been sending in audio clips for intros to the show. You Buzzkillers are so witty, you make such excellent fun of me, and you give me great new ideas for show types. You were the ones who came up with Man Crush Monday, Woman Crush Wednesday, and POS Saturday. Want to become famous? Please record an intro audio clip for us. Give us your name. Use Buzzkill as your last name if you want to retain anonymity, John Buzzkill, Jane Buzzkill, and your hometown. If you can slip in a crikey, a totally stoked, and a busting myths and taking names, that'd be great. Other than that, say what you want. If you have a man crush on Professor Philip Nash, put it in there. Record it on your iPhone using Voice Memos app or whatever phone app you have, depending on your type of actual cell phone, or record it on your computer. Boomer Buzzkillers, get your kids or your grandkids to record it for you. Then email the sound clip file to us, info@professorbuzzkill.com. We'll get it on air as soon as possible. Thanks, Buzzkillers. Okay, we're back, Buzzkillers, with Professor Edward O'Donnell, who's talking to us about myths of the West and myths of the Wild West. Now, Professor, one of the things that really prompted the creation of this podcast was this idea that stories are told and retold, and they become sort of solidified in cultural minds, if you will. They're myths, but they become believed, and then when the movies comes along, that makes it all that much stronger. And what struck me about what you've talked in your Great Courses Plus class is what you call remembering the American West. And that was very much a constructed thing.
Very much. And what's interesting is the constructing of the idea and the mythology and the, kind of mystery of the West was constructed in that, in real time. So if we think about westward migration, westward settlement and so forth, that's, 1860s, 1890s, and so on. It's in the 1870s that the stories and the myths and the mythological figures and the ideas of gunslingers and, buffalo hunters and Indian wars, all that stuff starts to become mythologized and popularized and commodified and sold to people back east who have been increasingly fascinated by this wondrous place, this separate place in their minds across the Mississippi.
So does that mean that then some of the participants of the sort of, if you will, settlement of the West or the conquest of the West then went on and became performers in this early myth making? I mean, literally
Absolutely.
Performers on the stage, so to speak?
Yeah, because what happens is that the centerpiece figure is this guy named William Cody. We know him today as Buffalo Bill, and Buffalo Bill becomes the great showman and the great creator and popularizer of Western myths. But what's interesting is he's pretty authentic. He's born in Iowa in 1846. He grows up in Kansas, which at the time really was the West, and he has a pretty varied career. He drives a wagon. He's a gold prospector. He does a small stint with the Pony Express. And, during the Civil War, he's a scout for the Union Army out in the West. And in just a couple of years after the war, he starts leading buffalo hunts and, making pretty good money doing it, and sometimes occasionally getting a gig taking, celebrities on buffalo hunts. This is why buffalo nearly goes extinct.
Safari thing. Like people do
precisely.
Now, rich people. Yeah, okay.
Yep, and set them up in camp and have all their needs taken care of, but then make sure that they had were brought close enough to bag a buffalo or 20, which was the goal in those days, unfortunately. But in 1869, back east, a entertainer and writer named Ned Buntline begins to write about Cody, and write loosely tied to reality, but really sort of embellished tales of this legendary figure in the West named Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill finds out that he's the star of these dime novels, which are very popular at the time. And in 1872, Buntline brings him to New York and puts him on stage. And he gets up there and just like a one-man show, starts telling stories. And it turns out he's pretty good at it. Yeah, one-man show. He's pretty good at it.
The sort of only example of individualism in the West.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, except that, of course, he had to have this Eastern promoter to help create it.
Exactly. So it is a good example in many ways. And so Buffalo Bill appears on the New York stage quite frequently, and the shows come and go, and he expands his tales and gets better and better at this thing, and he's also got this authenticity about him because he's not a fictional character. He really was out there in the West and really was involved in Indian wars and so forth, and did hunt buffalo. And this, as time goes by in the 1870s, he realizes there's just an insatiable appetite among Easterners for this mythical place and mythical stories about the West. And so in 1883, he basically puts together what can only be described as a Western-themed circus, and he calls it the Wild West. Anytime, if people ever said to him, "Tell me about the Wild West show," he would put up his hand and insist that they correct themselves, because it's not a show, it's the Wild West. And and they would ride into town, typically on a railroad, and set up for weeks at a time in some places, and tents, basically like a three-ring circus. But all the entertainment was reenactments of aspects of the West. So they would do an episode on the Pony Express, and this is why. And I know you've done a show on the Pony Express. It's why the Pony Express, this very short-lived, total failure of an enterprise of moving the mail, across the West, has legendary status because Buffalo Bill told us that it was an amazing thing and replayed that episode over and over and over again.
When in reality, most Pony Express mail went by railroad.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really was this kind of footnote of history that was pulled out of the footnotes and turned into this emblem of manhood and sacrifice and daring do. But the whole thing lasted a little bit over a year. It was never very much of a success. And so Buffalo Bill, but people love that stuff. And they also did, the attack on a wagon train. So they would have, 5 or 6 covered wagons heading across and again, imagine sort of a large circus stadium that's been set up. And suddenly the Indians begin to whoop and holler, and they turn the wagon train into a wagon circle. So they circle the wagons, as we get a lot of our expressions in our common lingo from the West. And then the fight ensues. And of course, if you know anything about Native Americans, then warriors, and these are real Native Americans for the most part. So again, Buffalo Bill insisted on sort of this notion of authenticity. So he hired them, and they traveled with the white performers as well, and they would ride around the wagon circle and fire at them, and then eventually they'd be chased off. Well, if you ever the reason why Hollywood later would replicate that was because that's what people expected, even though, forming a circle is not necessarily the best, and being Native Americans riding in circles around the circle, making themselves perfect targets, it's really not really how it unfolded. But Hollywood eventually basically takes that circular version of Native American versus settler conflict and puts it on the screen. And it's only circular because Buffalo Bill's stadium was a circle.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I was going to say, because it fits into a relatively limited space, and everybody can see sort of all around it. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and almost any Western that you see from the 30s, 40s, and 50s has that same setup. Yeah. Even though militarily it doesn't make any sense, and it also is not the way Native Americans typically took on Western settlers like that. And then probably the most popular reenactment that they did was Custer's Last Stand. Taking the famous dashing Custer and his 7th Cavalry, which are wiped out in the summer of 1876, and turning it from a absolute blunder of epic proportions, the greatest defeat in U.S. military history in some respects, because every single person is killed. They turned it into somehow valorizing and saying that they went down, but they went down with their manhood intact, their masculinity intact, they bravely fought to the last bullet and so forth. It's not really how it played out, but it made for tremendous theater. And of course, the Buffalo Bill had sort of some vague tie to Custer, and so the way that particular episode ended was with Buffalo Bill riding in on his horse just as just as Custer died, and it was a flag, a banner would unfurl saying "Too late." Suggesting if only Buffalo Bill had been on the scene, Custer and his men would have rallied and won the day. And so this was performed all across the country, never nonstop, from 1883 to 1917. It went around the world. And so one of my favorite photos to show my students is a photo of Buffalo Bill and several cowboys and Native Americans in gondolas in Venice, because they traveled the world. And
we'll have to find a picture of that for social media.
Yeah, and they were, a global sensation. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. So
I think they
it's
might have
a
performed in front of Queen Victoria too, but I'm not sure. I shouldn't
yes.
speculate on this show, but I think that's true.
Yep, and if I remember correctly, I remember reading a biography of Winston Churchill, and he had a very unhappy childhood that is very much neglected by his parents. And I seem to remember distinctly him begging his parents to come take him. He heard that Buffalo Bill was in town, and begging his parents to come fetch him from boarding school and to take him to see Buffalo Bill. So there's no question that the global presence of Buffalo Bill in the imagination of Europe and parts of Asia was very, very vivid. There's also there's a great poster from when he traveled to France, and it just has his face superimposed on a buffalo, and it just says "Je viens," which means I am coming, and that's all. It just doesn't say Buffalo Bill, doesn't say Wild West. It's just his face and a buffalo and je viens. And so you know when you can advertise like that, and particularly in that era when advertising was always loaded with words, you have some sort of global cachet that few can compare to.
Professor, it just continues to astound me. On this show, we especially blame the movies for things, especially World War II movies and all kinds of things. But all these forms of entertainment predate the movies, and they're just as effective. Not only the Buffalo Bill show, but these Wild West stories, you say, that are printed back in the East. It's like, and you go all the way back, I suppose, to the Canterbury Tales. It's as if the fictionalization of history starts from day one.
Yep. I mean, I think we are, as a species, we are storytelling people, gather around the fire
absolutely.
and tell stories. And you tell stories that sometimes are just purely entertaining, and sometimes they, contain moral or ethical or social messages. And I think for Americans, the stories of the West were sort of telling us who we were and what we were, that we were rugged, we were tough, we were individualistic, we never quit. And again, myths aren't false, 100% false. They're just sort of twisted and misrepresentations and exaggerations. So those aspects of American culture can be true, but they are not they're simply not the only aspects of our culture and our identity. And you're right; it goes way, way back to the very beginning. And the movies are really sort of the fourth or fifth stage of that evolution. Moving from his traveling West circus to going before that dime novels and so forth.
Well, and of course, if they weren't mythological, if they weren't exaggerations, if they weren't full of misunderstandings and misconceptions and misrepresentations, we wouldn't have a show and we wouldn't be rolling in the cash we're rolling in. But listen, Buzzkillers, there's another great history show out there, which I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again now since you're on the line, Professor, is one of my favorite podcasts, In the Past Lane. Why don't you enlighten the Buzzkillers who don't already know about it?
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, it's In the Past Lane with a P, and I take on topics in U.S. history. So basically, once a week, I drop an episode. They tend to be on the shorter side these days. And what I do is I talk about key things that happened this week in U.S. history. So key events, key people that were born, and then I talk more at length about one particular story. So this week, for example, I'm talking about the famous Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, which was one of the great gaudy Gilded Age moments of really announcing the Gilded Age, where they had this, massive ball that cost, in today's dollars, $6 million and so forth. And not just simply tell that story, but sort of explain what it told us about that era and what it meant, at the time, and how it sort of signaled kind of a big transformation in American culture and American politics.
Well, and we love it. It's, it's just fantastic stuff. And it's these podcasts and things like your work with the great courses we're really doing our best to give the best information we have out there to everyone. And we hope, of course, that Buzzkillers will subscribe to In the Past Lane. And we'll put, of course, links to it on our blog post for this and in social media. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Professor.
All right. Well, thank you. Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. And we'll say to you Buzzkillers out there, talk to you next week.